Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. In recent months on the channel, amongst many things, we have looked at the entirety of the Streets of Rage series and many games featuring the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Two things seem to have been made clear from all of this. You, my audience, seem to really love the company known as Sega, and of course, ninjas! Or I guess heroes, as we like to refer to them in my region. So I thought, why not begin looking at Sega's biggest ninja-based franchise, considering crossover appeal is probably there. There are a lot of entries in the Shinobi series, so to make things simple, I thought today we would take an in-depth look at the first Shinobi game from Sega and try to pinpoint just what it was about this game that would spawn so many sequels. So, without further ado, let's look at the history of this game, the gameplay itself, and even the many ports that exist of this arcade game. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of Shinobi, one of Sega's greatest ever series. Yeah! To start today's story off, we need to go back to 1987. This was a period in Sega history before there was a Streets of Rage, Golden Axe or Sonic the Hedgehog. Hell, the world would not have even been swept off its feet yet by the Sega Mega Drive either. Prior to this, Sega had been one of the top competitors in the arcade industry, with some fantastic releases prior to Shinobi, such as Hang On and Space Harrier. In fact, Sega had only entered the console market in the first place as they had feared that after Nintendo had conquered the home market with the Famicom, they would take the arcade market from Sega. In many ways, a similar scenario played out when Microsoft entered the console market, with a primary motivation factor for them being that they feared that one day the PlayStation would try to take away the PC market. Self-defense marketing basically. In 1983, Sega would launch the SG-1000, on the same day as Nintendo would launch their Famicom. But the SG-1000 with its ColecoVision-like hardware failed to ignite consumers' interests. This would result in the system receiving multiple revisions, by 1985 morphing into the SG-1000 Mark III, which would be marketed in the rest of the world as the Sega Master System. The Master System carved out a bigger niche than what came before it, but was still overshadowed by the success of the Famicom. But despite all of this, Sega would arguably still have a much bigger presence than Nintendo in the arcades. This is the realm where Sega's biggest releases from the period would first surface, and in 1987 Shinobi was amongst the multiple Sega titles published. Shinobi was developed by an internal research and development team working at Sega, known as AM1, with AM standing for amusement machines. The team were responsible for other classic releases around the time period, such as Alien Syndrome for example. Under the leadership of Yutaka Sugano, Shinobi was created for the Sega System 16 arcade board, featuring gameplay mechanics reminiscent of those seen featured in Namco's Rolling Thunder, which had been released in arcades the previous year. The word Shinobi is basically a Japanese synonym for ninja, or a male ninja more specifically. As we know, ninjas are covert agents or mercenaries in feudal Japan. The functions of ninjas included espionage, deception and surprise attacks, so essentially ninjas functioned perfectly to fit straight into action movies and video games. And considering video games seemed to just be coming into their own in the 80s, franchises like Shinobi and Ninja Gaiden would be just two of many series that would rely on the ninja archetype. Sadly, if you type in ninja popularity into the Google search bar, you just get force-fed a ton of information on this boring pleb. But if you dig a little deeper, it becomes more prevalent as to why ninjas became such a big deal throughout the 1980s, and the perfect base for Sega to build a franchise around. The first time the word ninja arose in Western popular culture was when it was used within Ian Fleming's 1964 James Bond novel You Only Live Twice, which featured Bond taking on an elite Japanese ninja force. The novel was turned into a movie in 1967, and the ninja concept captivated Western audiences around the world. In some ways, it could be argued that this James Bond film would spark an interest in Japanese martial arts, and act as a catalyst for martial arts movies to become mainstream in the 70s. These martial arts movies, which starred the likes of Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris, were not necessarily about ninjas, but provided enough Eastern influences for marketeers to slap the word ninja on most of these properties anyway. In terms of the traditional depiction of a ninja from feudal Japan, they offered easy cross-appeal to Westerners due to the fact that they were people who worked outside the system. Badass fighters who took on the system and sought justice beyond the law. Ninjas waved the flag of individualism, a key value held by Western democracies, and easily got over with the public for much of the very same reasons as Stone Cold Steve Austin. Working class heroes. Pair this with the fact these figures fit perfectly into the 80s vision of superheroes being dark, violent and out of control. Japanese shinobis fit perfectly into the mainstream appeal of that era. So this is why we got so many ninja games throughout that period. They were basically dark, cool and edgy, just like Batman. In Sega Shinobi's case, the player controls a modern day ninja named Joe Musashi, who in the game's plot has to stop a terrorist organisation known as Zed, who are kidnapping the students of his clan. Upon starting a playthrough of this glorious game, you take control of Joe in side-scrolling action as you make your way through a cityscape. The title features simple controls and movement is achieved via the arcade's 8-directional joystick. Units also feature 3 action buttons, which are used for attacking, jumping and performing ninjutsu techniques known as ninja magic in this game's case. Movement is quite varied for a game released this long ago. Using the joystick, players can walk, crouch and walk together and jump up and down between floors. Basically, the game lets you move like a ninja. Now, in terms of attacking, Joe can utilise an unlimited supply of shurikens and can punch and kick too when in close range of enemies. Joe can upgrade his attacking capabilities though by rescuing the many hostages that are littered throughout this game's many stages. Doing so grants power-ups. For example, his shurikens can be replaced with guns that fire large explosive bullets, and his close range moves are replaced with katana slashes. Joe can also perform what is known as a Musashi ninjutsu technique once every stage, which is basically a screen nuke. The game features a range of different enemy sprites, some who we will talk more about shortly, but a nice touch with this game is that you can bump into enemies without being harmed. Instead, enemies must strike Joe with an attack to do damage, which is a nice realistic change of pace absent from most platforming games from the 80s. Deaths can also be caused from falling down bottomless pits, an age-old platforming trope. The first stage of the game takes place in a cityscape, which sees players fighting their way through gun-wielding mercenaries and Mongolian swordmen, who are guarding each hostage. The first section of the stage features some crates to jump over and hide behind to avoid bullets, and some platforms to jump on. Essentially, this whole stage section is designed to allow players to get to grips with the game. The next section of a stage is slightly longer, and basically only features one plane to fight on. This area introduces wall climbing ninjas who can fight Joe from above or jump down to the ground to cause issues there instead. The large samurai-like figure, who was briefly seen at the end of the last stage area, briefly makes an appearance at the end of this area too. The third section of the stage sees the player face off one-on-one with this boss fighter. His fireball attacks must be avoided, and he can be defeated by being struck several times in his head. This is made clear to the player by the fact that his head is freaking glowing like a beacon to ensure players know what to do. Slaying this foe brings an end to the whole stage, and the introduction to the game's first bonus round. Basically a simple, intuitive game where Joe throws ninja stars at enemies from a first-person perspective. When doing this perfectly, players can earn extra lives. Bonus rounds like this occur between every stage. Mission 2 features much of the same style gameplay and enemies as the first mission, but some nice perspective effects are shown off early on, when Joe walks behind the stage railings. When getting to the end of the first section of this stage, a helicopter retreats, who obviously acts as the stage's boss later on. The next part of the area introduces katana-wielding ninja enemies and introduces some stage variety by offering up an area where players must ascend upwards to complete the section, rather than side-scrolling from left to right, further putting players' ninja skills to the test. Players then must side-scroll through a dock area, involving jumping from platform to platform whilst avoiding attacks from ninjas wearing full scuba wear, who jump at the player from the waters below. Completing this section brings players to the game's second boss, which, as we know, is a fight against a freaking attack helicopter. Like the previous boss, the helicopter has a flashing section in which players must attack to bring it down. The helicopter is tougher to strike, as it can ascend up and down as well as strike the player via shooting missiles, and even deploying ninja enemy sprites to take down the player. Overall, this is a fun little boss fight though. Mission 3 takes place out in the wilderness and introduces players to rocket launcher wielding enemies. After entering a cave, players are confronted with the first section of the game, where to progress they must descend downwards, which is achievable via jumping down from pipe to pipe. Players eventually descend to an industrial electronic sort of area, where Sega are promoting their own brand. The railings in this area continue to build on the game's perspective effects too. A boss fight takes place on this stage against spinning mechanical figures, who, if not taken out in time, crush the player against a wall of electricity. The main part of this fight takes place against a moving head that spits fireballs. Like other bosses, it has a glowing section to hit for damage. Once Mission 4 commences, players head towards a fortress-like building, jumping over obstacles and taking out enemies. New enemy sprites appear in this area, who appear to be strange jumping monsters, along with undead katana-wielding foes. Not much changes once inside, except there are some bottomless pits to avoid, and platforming and enemy distribution gets trickier as players go deeper into the stage. The stage culminates with an encounter against a samurai known as Red Lobster. Moving on to stage 5, the player moves past the fortress wall as the level of difficulty continues to be ramped up, before next entering what seems to be a bamboo fortress, offering some beautiful scenery for combat to take place in. Players enter a building and the Eastern theme continues as Joe fights his way through an area with a zigzagging pattern. Once through this section, players take on the final boss, who was imaginatively named the Masked Ninja. He has by far the game's largest attack pattern variety and can perform a host of elemental attacks, thus making him the most challenging opponent in the game. The game finally ends with a text scroll informing us that the man behind the terrorist group is a gentleman known as Nakahara, the very man who taught Joe everything. He was responsible for all of the chaos that ensued in this game, simply because he wanted to recreate the feudal era of Japan, so that he could see ninjas play an active role in the world once again, and he would have got away with it too, if it was not for you pesky meddling kids. As mentioned, the highly popular and critically acclaimed Shinobi came out in an era before Sega had a significant console market share, and there was no powerful Mega Drive system to easily port the game to. So in order to maximise profits, not only would Sega release this game on their own 8-bit Master System, but they would pretty much release it on every platform under the sun. So let's look at some of the many versions that exist of this 1987 game. As was often the case with games made in this era, to make the titles easily available in the home for mostly the European market, Shinobi would be ported to a number of home and microcomputers. Considering that all of these platforms were so different, it would be too much work for Sega to port these games themselves, so instead a company known as Sales Curve developed the Amiga, Atari ST, Commodore 64, Amstrad and ZX Spectrum versions, whereas Micro Mosaic would develop the IBM PC version. As expected, with the outsourcing of these ports, none of these were the best way of experiencing Shinobi around the time frame. Japan would get a version of the game made bespoke for their market too, released on the PC Engine, after being developed by Asmic. Graphically, this is a good looking game for the time it was released, although some content has been cut, such as the bonus rounds and many of the power-ups. It seems to be that this version of the game plays at a faster pace too than its arcade counterpart, which is not necessarily a good thing considering ninjas are meant to move stealthily. When I mentioned that Sega were releasing this game for everything, I was not exaggerating. Shinobi would even be released for the Nintendo Entertainment System. I guess the fact that Nintendo were the company's arch rival, and the fact that they had entered the console market to stop Nintendo progressing in the arcade market, was not enough to stop Sega back then from porting the game over to the system. I guess this was the best way to sell home versions of the game to the North American market, a region where the Master System had barely scraped sales. Hilariously though, this version of the game was published on a Tengen cartridge, meaning that Sega never made Nintendo any licensing fees for the privilege of releasing this game on Nintendo hardware. As you can see, the NES port looks very much graphically like your typical NES game, and most of the title can be found here. However, all vertical scrolling areas in the game had to be replaced with side scrolling areas for some reason. The best home version of the original game can be found on, of course, Sega's own hardware, the Master System. The game was tuned to make it less arcadey and more bespoke to be played at home. For example, the game was made easier by giving players health gauges as opposed to being killed by one-hit knockouts. Although annoyingly, Joe can now be hurt by touching enemies, rather than needing to be hit by them, removing an element of realism from the game. There are lots of other minor changes here too, but arguably, this version of the game could deliver the best Shinobi experience at home in the 80s. Many years later, the original arcade game was ported more faithfully to a range of modern hardware such as the Nintendo Wii, PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, and being included as part of a Sega collection in later years as well. More interestingly, a mobile version of the game would arrive on the scene too, featuring all new, arguably superior graphics. Sadly, the gameplay looks sluggish and reportedly even has a delay when hitting the phone's keys. All in all though, as you can see, the original arcade version of Shinobi was great fun and inspired a hell of a lot of ports and even more sequels, which, depending on if people enjoy this retrospective today, we will look at some of the game's sequels in this channel in the future. If you enjoyed today's video, let me know in the comment section which Sega titles you would like to see me cover in detail in the future. If this is your first time here, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell as I release multiple videos on gaming history every week. This channel is mostly funded by the people who back it over on Patreon, who receive content early, vote on video topics, gain access to my Patreon Discord, can access my exclusive vlog posts, get their names in the credits at the end of these videos, and much more. These videos are dedicated to you. So, huge thank yous and shout outs go out to Sebastian Venice, Carl Johnson, Heyo Paula Lopez, Joseph Rasmick, Doug Perkins, A Murder of Crows, Ego, Alethea Swanson, Angel Light 85, Asobi Quang DX, Aswell Warakai, Brian Barry, Camber Rambo 82, Carlos Domingos, Computer Man, Daniel Daly, EC Professor, Evan Border, Gary Pinkett, Gianni V. Santisi, Glennie Glenn, Hamid Musa, House of the Ted, Joaquin Varela, Jordan Durant, Keith Ferguson, Lars Zondervan, Matthew Robinson, Michael Cullix, Nick Daniels, Philip Manth, Prince Knight, Princess Zana, SpongeMat B, Timothy W. Haskins II, TOG Driver, Since Spaces, Adam Castin, Adrian Hannington, Andis Rainsberg, Andrew Bazansky, Andrew Pearson, Angry Little SOB, Antonio Rodriguez, Bernard NG, Baba Kitty, Chris Fisk, Chris Margarine, Chris Cool, Craig Jenkins, Crazy Yarl, Dan Barlow Jr., Dan Van Dam, David Ball, Francesco Lacriola, Gregory Smaragewitz, Hans Christian, Ivan M, James Bishop, James McDonald, JB, Jazzy Tay, Joel, John Bates, Kings Knight, Langston Miller, Lobster Puncher, Luis Viant, Luke Canava, Marco Soto, Marvin Aroliga, Master Jinx, Matthew Rindle, Mean Machine Dean, Michael Hall, Mike Bruno, Noob, Paul Elliott, PlayStation's Better, PostDXL, Punky Dudester, RetroVersion.com, Richard Stew Stewart, Rick67, Ron Studd, Sarah Powell, Sarai H. Al Sarai, Stephen Lewis, Time Lord Soundwave, Tom Elliott, Vlamik Renee, Wazzo Jugs, Zai. Thank you all so much for supporting this channel. Yeah. Cheerio.